The Cossacks covered the plain. They charged us and kept up a furious fire, grape shot. Ney, who could not make any return to this destructive cannonade, hastened his march, dispersing, overthrowing everything that dared oppose him. He marched for a wood which was not far distant. He was on the point of reaching it when a battery was unmasked on him and disorganized his column. The soldiers waver and throw down their arms, but the marshal soon restores them to their courage. His words, his voice, his example encourage the most timid. They rush on. The enemy's artillery fly. We are masters of the wood. But there were neither roads nor paths through this thicket. It was intersected by so many ravines, and there were so many obstacles that it was with infinite difficulty that it was traversed. Nearly all the material was left in it. The Cossacks became the more daring. For 2 days they never ceased renewing their attacks, but they had themselves been obliged to make a circuit. Their cannon was in arrear. They had no artillery. A few voltigeurs did justice on them. Ney was close upon Orsa. The night was advanced. He marched in silence. He flattered himself that he had at last ridded himself of the enemy. On a sudden, he perceives the fire of bivouacs. He discovers the camp of a numerous army. He did not know whether he should rejoice or tremble, whether they were Russians or French. When a fire opened upon him removes his uncertainty, the reconnoitering parties are received with discharges of musketry, explosions, cries, drums are mingled and confounded together. One would have thought that we were to give battle to all Russia. Furious at seeing danger return at the moment when he thought that he had escaped from it, the marshal makes an effort to open a passage. He rushes towards the fires, but the camp is deserted. It is a trick, a stratagem. Platov had, it appears, taken us for his own troops. He had thought to frighten us with shadows. The Duke disdained to follow a few Cossacks who had been employed in this phantasmagoria. He continued his march, and 3 leagues further on reached the 4th Corps. Chapter 36. While this was going on, we had left Krasnoy. Napoleon marched on foot at the head of his guard and often talked of Ney. He called to mind his coup d'oeil, so accurate and true. His courage, proof against everything. In short, all the qualities which made him so brilliant on the field of battle. He is lost. Well, I have 300 millions in the Tuileries. I would give them if he were restored to me. He fixed his headquarters at Dubrovna. He lodged with a Russian lady who had the courage not to abandon her house. I was on duty that day. The emperor sent for me towards 1 o'clock in the morning. He was very much dejected. It was difficult for him not to be so. The scene was frightful. He observed to me, my affairs are going on very badly. These poor soldiers rend my heart. I cannot, however, relieve them. There was a cry of 2 arms. Firing was heard. Everything was in an uproar. Go see what it is, Napoleon said to me with the greatest sang-froid. I am sure that they are some rogues of Cossacks who want to hinder us from sleeping. It was in reality a false alarm. He was not satisfied with some personages whom I abstained from naming. What set of tragedy, kings without energy, courage, or moral force? Have I been able to deceive myself to such a degree? To what men have I trusted myself? Poor Ney! With whom have I matched thee? We set off for Orsa and fixed our quarters at a Jesuits' convent. Napoleon despaired of ever seeing the rear guard. Neither did we see any more of the Russian infantry. It was probable that they had taken some position. They ought to have let nothing escape. The next day we pushed on 2 leagues farther. We halted in a wretched hamlet. It was there that the emperor learned towards the evening of Ney's arrival and his having joined the 4th Corps. It may be easily conceived what joy he experienced and in what manner he received the marshal on the next day. We reached Borisov. Oudinot had beaten Lambert. The fugitives had joined Chichagov and covered the right bank of the Berezina. Napoleon was uneasy. We had neither bridge train nor subsistence. The main army was advancing. The troops from Moldavia blockaded the passage. We were surrounded on every side. The situation was frightful and unheard of. Nothing less than the talents and the great decision of the emperor was necessary to extricate us from so great a difficulty. No Frenchman, not even Napoleon, could expect to escape. This prince stopped a short time at Borsov, gave orders for the false attack, which saved us, and marched towards Oudinot's headquarters a few leagues distant. We slept a little on this side of the place at a country house which belonged to Prince Redesvel. General Mouton, myself, passed the night there on a handful of straw. We thought on the morrow, and our reflections were not cheerful. We set off on our journey at 4 o'clock. We were in one of the emperor's calaces. We perceived the fires of the Russians. They occupied the opposite bank. The woods, the marshes were full of them. They reached beyond our range of sight. The river was deep, muddy, all covered with floating pieces. It was here that we were to cross or surrender. We augured badly of success. The general explained himself with frankness. He had often done it before Napoleon, who treated him as a malcontent, but nevertheless liked him very much. We arrived at Oudinot's headquarters. Day was just beginning to dawn. The emperor conversed a moment with the marshal, took some refreshment and gave orders, nay, took me apart. We went out together. He said to me in German, "Our situation is unparalleled. If Napoleon extricates himself today, he must have the devil in him." We were very uneasy, and there was sufficient cause. The King of Naples came to us and was not less solicitous. I proposed to Napoleon, he observed to us, to save himself and cross the river at a few leagues' distance hence. I have some Poles who would answer for his safety and would conduct him to Vilna, but he rejects the proposal and will not even hear it mentioned. As for me, I do not think we can escape. We were all three of the same opinion. Murat replied, "We will all get over. We can never think of surrendering." While conversing, we perceived the enemy were filing off. Their masses had disappeared. The fires were extinguished. Nothing more than the ends of the columns, which were lost in the wood, were seen, and from 500 to 600 Cossacks that were scattered on the plain. We examined with the telescope. We were convinced that the camp was raised. I went to Napoleon, who was conversing with Marshal Oudinot. "Sire, the enemy have left their position. That is impossible." The King of Naples and Marshal Ney arrived and confirmed what I had just announced. The emperor came out from his barrack, cast his eyes on the other side of the river. I have outwitted the admiral. He could not pronounce the name. Chichikov. He believes me to be at the point where I ordered the false attack. He is running the Borisov. His eyes sparkled with joy and impatience. He urged the erection of the bridges and mounted 20 pieces of cannon in the battery. These are commanded by a brave officer with a wooden leg called Brechtel. A ball carried it off during the action and knocked him down. "Look," he said to one of his gunners, "for another leg in wagon number 5. He fitted it on and continued his firing. The emperor made 60 men swim across under the command of Colonel Jacqueminot. They ventured imprudently in pursuit of the Cossacks. One of them was taken in question and informed the Russians where Napoleon was. Chichikov retraced his steps, but it was too late. Napoleon, his guard, Ney, Oudinot, and all the troops which these marshals retained had passed. The admiral, confused by having been duped, forgot the marshes of Lublin. The bridge, which extended a league and a quarter over the swampy ground, was our only escape. If it had been destroyed, he would have had our fate still in his hands. But Wittgenstein commenced the firing on the left bank. He occupied the right. His soldiers were wallowing in plenty. A handful of men, sinking under the burden of a wretched life, might have been trampled underfoot. He neglected the defile. Eugene hastened to get possession of it. We were sure of our rear. We waited for Chichikov. We were 8,000, fainting from fatigue and hunger. He had the army of Moldavia. The issue of the combat did not appear doubtful to him. He advanced with the ardor of victory. The action commenced. The troops were intermixed. The ground was heaped with the dead. Ney directs, animates the charges. Everywhere the Russians are surrounded. They rally. They bring up fresh forces. But Birkheim comes up. The cuirassiers rush on their columns. All were cut to pieces. Napoleon was surrounded by his guard, which he had drawn up in order of battle. At the entrance to the forest, it was still fine, and of an imposing appearance. 2,000 prisoners defiled before them. We were intoxicated with so noble a result. Our joy was but of short duration. The account given by some Russians damped it. Partneau had been taken. All his divisions had laid down their arms. An aide-de-camp of Marshal Victor came to confirm this sad news. Napoleon was deeply affected with so unexpected a misfortune. Must this loss come to spoil all after having escaped as by a miracle and having completely beaten the Russians? The combat was still very warm on the left bank. From 4,000 to 5,000 men opposed to the enemy's army, an obstinate resistance. Go and see what is the state of things. Ascend the right bank. Examine what is passing on the left. Come and give me an account of it. I went and saw brilliant charges of infantry and cavalry. Those which General Fournier conducted were particularly conspicuous by their simultaneousness and impetuosity. But the disproportion was immense. We were forced to give way. The horrors of the bridge began. It is useless to recall this scene of desolation. We left the dreary banks of the Berezina, where we had acquired so much glory and experienced so many misfortunes. We marched on towards Vilna. We discoursed of nothing. We were occupied with nothing but the arrival of the Austrians. The lowest soldier dreamed of nothing but Schwarzenberg. Where is he? What is he doing? Why does he not appear? I will not permit myself any reflections on the movement of this prince, then our ally. For a long time, we had no news from France. We were ignorant of what was going on in the Grand Duchy. We were informed of it at Malatekno. Napoleon received 19 dispatches at once. It was there, I believe, that he determined on the plan of quitting the army, but he did not execute it till at Smargoni, 18 leagues from Vilna. We reached that place. The emperor sent for me towards 2 o'clock. He carefully closed the doors of the apartment that he occupied. He said to me, "Well, Rapp, I set out this night for Paris. My presence is necessary there for the good of France, and even for the welfare of this unfortunate army. I shall give the command of it to the King of Naples." I was not prepared for this mark of confidence, for I frankly avow that I was not in the secret of the journey. "Sire," I answered, "your departure will cause a melancholy sensation among the troops. They do not expect it. My return is indispensable. It is necessary to watch over Austria and keep Prussia within bounds. I am ignorant of what the Austrians will do. Their sovereign is your father-in-law. But for the Prussians, you will not keep them. Our disasters are too great. They will profit by them." Napoleon walked up and down with his hands behind his back. He kept silence for a moment and replied, "When they know that I am at Paris and see me at the head of the nation and of 1,200,000 men, which I shall organize, they will look twice before they make war. Duracell and Cormouton will set off with me. Lauriston will go to Warsaw, and you will return to Danzig. You will see Ney at Vilna, with whom you will stop at least 4 days. Murat shall join you. You shall try to rally the army as well as you are able. The magazines are full. You will find everything in abundance. You will stop the Russians. You shall strike a blow with Ney if it is necessary. He will have already the Loison division composed of 18,000 fresh troops. Fred is also bringing up to him 10,000 Bavarians. Other reinforcements are on the march. You will go into cantonments." Napoleon departed. I received orders from the Major General, who informed me in a letter what Napoleon had already told me himself. He sent me at the same time a private letter from the Emperor in which he repeated, "Do all you can to rally the army at Vilna. Remain there 4 days at least, and you will go to Danzig." The next day I set off. The cold was intense. That when I arrived at Vilna, I had my nose, one of my ears, and 2 fingers frozen. I stopped at General Hogendorp's and went straight to Marshal Ney's quarters. I informed him of Napoleon's orders and of the conversation which I had with him at the moment of his departure. The marshal was greatly astonished at Napoleon's estimate of the number of his troops. "Just now," he said to me, "I beat the call to arms, and I was not able to raise 500. Everyone is frozen, fatigued, and discouraged. No one will make any further effort. You have the appearance of being in pain. Go and rest yourself. Tomorrow we shall see." The next day I went to him. The King of Naples had just arrived with the guard. We conversed much about our situation. Ney wished for a retreat. He thought it indispensable. "It is forced on us. There are no means of stopping stopping a day longer, he had not ended. Before the report of cannon was heard, the Russians arrived in force. They were fighting at a distance of half a league from us. All at once, we saw the Bavarians returning in confusion. They were pell-mell with those of our troops that had been dragging behind. Confusion was at its height. As Ney had foretold, it was impossible to do anything with our troops. The King of Naples came to us. He still hoped to make some resistance, but the reports which he received from the heights of Vilna undeceived him. He immediately ordered a retrograde movement. It went towards the Niemen. I advise you, said the prince, to set off without delay for Danzig, where your presence will soon be wanted. The least delay may cause you to fall into the hands of the Cossacks. That would be an untoward accident, which would be profitable neither to the army nor to the emperor. Followed this advice. I heard 2 Jews who conducted me to the Niemen. My equipages, which had hitherto fortunately escaped all disaster, were ready on the road. We soon arrived at the fatal heights, where we were obliged to abandon all the remainder of our material. It was impossible to ascend it. Our horses were worn out from in unsuccessful attempts. We assisted them, we urged them, but the ground was too slippery, so steep, that we were obliged to give up the undertaking. I consulted with my aide-de-camp on the steps which it was best to take. My Israelites proposed that we should follow a crossroad, which had, besides other things, the advantage of being shorter. They begged me to trust to them. They would answer for me. I believed them. We set off. On the next evening, we were across the Niemen. I suffered horribly. My fingers, my nose, my ear were beginning to give me great uneasiness when a Polish barber pointed out a remedy rather disagreeable, but which succeeded. I arrived at last at Danzig. The King of Naples followed at some days' march distance. MacDonald, whom the Prussians had so unworthily betrayed, was coming after us. It is only by a miracle, he informed me, that myself, my staff, and the 7th Divisions have not been destroyed. We were delivered up. Our legs saved us. He sent me his troops, which were incorporated with those that I had under my orders. The Russians appeared almost immediately. General Bachelet had a very smart engagement with them. They spread themselves around the place, and the blockade began. Chapter 37. Danzig appeared made by nature for a fortress, washed on the north by the Vistula, protected on the southwest by a chain of precipitous heights. It is defended on all their sides by an inundation which is spread by means of 2 rivers which traverse it, the Redown and the Motlav. Struck with the advantages of so fine a situation, Napoleon had resolved to render it impregnable. He had caused some immense works to be begun. Têtes de pont forts and trench camps were to protect it from insult and overlook the course of the river, but time had been wanting, and most of the works were either imperfect or scarcely traced out. No magazine was bomb-proof, no shelter sufficiently solid to keep the garrison in security. The casemates were uninhabitable, the quarters were in ruins, and the parapets tumbling down. The cold, still very severe, had frozen the waters, and Danzig, the situation of which is naturally so happy and so strong, was nothing more than a place open at every point. The garrison was not in a better state. It was composed of a confused mass of soldiers of all kinds and of all nations. There were French, Germans, Poles, Africans, Spaniards, Dutch, and Italians. The greater number, worn out or deceased, had been thrown into Danzig because they were unable to continue their march. They had hoped to find some relief there, but destitute of all medicines, of animal food and vegetables, without spirits or forage, I was obliged to send away those who were not absolutely incapable of leaving the place. Nevertheless, I had 35,000 left, out of which there were not above 8 or 10,000 fighting men. Even these were nearly all recruits who had neither experience nor discipline. This circumstance, indeed, did not much alarm me. I was acquainted with our soldiers. I knew that for them to fight well, they only wanted an example. I was resolved not to spare myself. Such was the deplorable state in which the place and the troops charged with defending it were found. It was necessary for us to provide for the most important point, to shelter ourselves from attack. The thing was not easy. The snow covered the fortifications. It obstructed all the covert ways, all the avenues. The cold was extreme. The thermometer was more than 20 degrees below zero, and the ice was already several inches thick. Nevertheless, there was no time for hesitation. It was necessary to resolve to be carried by assault or to submit to fresh fatigues almost as excessive as those we had experienced. I consorted with two men whose devotedness was equal to their intelligence. These were Colonel Richemont and General Campredon. Both were attached to the Engineer Corps, of which the latter had the command. I gave orders to raise new works and to clear the waters of the Vistula. This undertaking appeared impracticable on account of the severity of the season. Nevertheless, the troops undertook it with their accustomed zeal, notwithstanding the cold which overwhelmed them. They never suffered a murmur or a complaint to escape them. They executed the tasks which were prescribed to them with a devotion and constancy beyond all praise. At last, after unparalleled difficulties, they surmounted every obstacle, the ice broken by hatchets, and moved with levers towards the sea. Assisted by the force of the stream, opened in the middle of the river a channel from 16 to 17 meters broad and 2 leagues and a half in length. But we were destined to see difficulties return as soon as they were overcome. Scarcely had an unexpected success crowned our efforts when the cold set in with redoubled severity. In one night, the Vistula, the ditches were covered with a sheet of ice almost as thick as the one we had broken. In vain were boats moved up and down incessantly to keep up by agitation the fluidity of the water. Neither these precautions nor the rapidity of the river could preserve it. It was necessary to resume those labors which had cost us so much and which a moment had destroyed. Day and night were employed in breaking the ice. We could not, nevertheless, prevent its forming again a third time, but more obstinate even than the elements which combined against us, our soldiers opposed their courage to these obstacles, and at last succeeded in triumphing them. All of the remainder of the front of the plain, the same zeal was shown, and the same difficulties occurred. The earth, frozen several feet deep, resisted the spade and braved the efforts of the pioneers. Nothing could separate this compact mass. Even the axe rebounded. It was necessary to have recourse to fire to melt it. Great piles of wood placed at distance from each other and kept up for a long time were the only means which enabled us to make excavations and to raise the necessary palisades. With great labor and perseverance, we had at last the satisfaction of seeing in a state of defense works that had only just been begun. The home Weichselmunde, the entrenched camp of Neufahrwasser, and multitude of forts which protect the approaches of Danzig were put in a situation to be able to offer noble resistance. And if this town was not raised to the degree of strength of which it was susceptible, it was at least capable of supporting a siege, the duration and adventures of which are not amongst those events which do most honor to foreign arms. These fatigues were more than human power could support. Bivouacking, privations, continual service aggravated their severity. Disease, consequently, was not slow in making its appearance from the first days of January. Every sun took from us 50 men. At the end of the following month, we were losing as many as 150, and we counted more than 15,000 sick. From the troops, the epidemic had passed to the inhabitants. It committed among them the most dreadful ravages. No age nor sex was spared. Those who were afflicted by poverty and those who were surrounded by ease and luxury were alike its prey. All gave way, all perished. The young, first entering on the path of life, the old, whose career was nearly run. Grief reigned in every family. Consternation was in every breast. Danzig, at other times so lively, now plunged in a melancholy silence, only offered in every direction to the saddened eye the pomp and procession of funerals, the sound of the bells, the hearses, the images of death reproduced under every form aggravated a situation already deplorable. The minds of the troops began to be shaken. I hastened to cut up the evil by its roots. I interdicted these funeral solemnities which the piety of the living consecrates to the dead. I had not waited for the epidemic to rage in all its violence before I opposed it. As soon as the first symptoms had been observed, I had caused hospitals to be opened, medicines, beds, and everything which is necessary for this part of the service to be purchased. A wholesome and plentiful food would have been more efficacious, but we were so badly provisioned that we could scarcely furnish for each day's allowance 2 ounces of fresh meat. A little salt meat, some dried beans, composed all that we had in our power to offer to men worn out by long privations. This state of things was cruel. I could not, however, remedy it. In any way, I had in vain dispatched a vessel for Stralsund in order to draw from Swedish Pomerania, which we still possessed, food and medicines. The sloop charged with my dispatches, assailed by a violent tempest, was driven on shore. We were approaching the equinox. The Baltic was already agitated by storms. It was not possible to make a second attempt. Courage was the only resource we had left. It was only at the point of the sword that we could obtain the means of subsistence, but whatever was the devotedness of the troops, prudence did not warrant conducting them against the enemy, exhausted as they were by disease and misery. It was necessary to resign ourselves to fate and patiently hope that the gentle influence of the fine season would come to recruit our strength. This was not far distant. All the signs which announced it were already showing themselves. The weather was milder, the ice was beginning to melt, the breaking up of the frost was near, and we flattered ourselves that the inundation would relieve to a certain degree the fatigues that we were suffering. But that which was expected to solace our misfortunes was always that which raised them to their height. The Vistula cleared itself with violence. Since 1775, there had never been an example of such impetuosity in the current. The finest part of the Danzig, its magazines, its arsenals, became a prey to the waves. The country was covered with water. Nothing presented itself for the extent of several leagues but the afflicting spectacle of trees torn up by their roots, of houses in ruins, of men, of cattle floating lifeless, and the confusion among the loose sea. Our destruction appeared inevitable. All our works were demolished, our palisades carried away, our sluices broken, our forts open and undermined by the waves, left us without the means of defense before a numerous enemy. We could no longer communicate with the home, a position so important, and of which the fortifications were nearly annihilated. The island of Hubuda was in a deplorable state. Our posts of the Werder, those of the Nierhung, had been submerged. To complete our misfortunes, we were threatened, when the Vistula should resume its course, with seeing the inundation which habitually surrounded the place dried up. Chapter 38. But the Allies did not well second the elements which were fighting for them. Instead of at once coming to the attack, they wasted their time in miserable intrigues. There were proclamations on proclamations, some for magistracy, some for the inhabitants, some for the soldiers. Some were excited to revolt, others to desert. The brave Poles, Westphalians, Bavarians were in turn solicited, pressed, and menaced. This paper war gave me little uneasiness. I knew the fidelity of my troops. I had the greatest confidence in them. I gave them a proof of it. As soon as the proclamations reached us, I had them read at the head of the regiments. This open conduct pleased them. They were grateful for it. They only had the greater contempt for an enemy who seemed to hold their honor more cheap than their courage. And they themselves often brought to me these fine productions of Russian genius without having read them. The besiegers persisted in remaining inactive before the place. I occasionally roused them from the lethargy into which they were plunged. These gentlemen threatened us rather insolently with an assault. They had even, towards the end of January, ordered a great number of ladders in the villages of the Werder. I resolved to make them see that we were not yet reduced so low. On the 29th, I put some troops in motion in the direction of Brantau. General Grandjean debouched from Stries with 4 battalions, a troop of cavalry, and 2 field pieces. He routed in his excursion some bands of Baskers and Cossacks. This was a prelude to a more serious action. I knew the fresh troops had arrived before the place, and that they were spread about in the Nierhung and occupied in force Bonsack and Stries. I sent to reconnoiter them. General Destrays was charged with this expedition, he routed at first everything which presented itself in this way, but his riflemen abandoned themselves too much to the pursuit and had nearly become victims of their rashness. A cloud of Cossacks fell on them and would have cut them to pieces if Colonel Farine had not saved them. We were less fortunate at another point. Our advanced posts had orders to keep under arms to observe the movements of the enemy, but not to engage in action. Colonel Heering, who commanded at Stolzenberg, could not contain himself. He imprudently descended into the plain and attacked the Cossacks with thoughtless impetuosity. His troops, surprised in a defile, could not withstand the shock of the cavalry and were broken. This piece of folly cost us 250 men. The enemy grew warm. This trivial success had given them confidence. Towards 3 in the afternoon, their columns presented themselves before Langführ and succeeded in establishing themselves there. 30 men posted in front of this village were taken prisoners. They had gone into a house and had made a long resistance. The ground was heaped with dead, but seeing no chance of relief, they were obliged to lay down their arms for want of ammunition. I immediately gave orders to retake this position. General Grandchamp began a march with 8 battalions, 4 pieces of artillery, and some cavalry. The attack was completely successful. The Russians were routed and put to flight. They endeavored to return to the charge, but always broken, always overwhelmed by our cavalry. They appeared at last, decided on retreating. We were not slow in following their example. The field of battle was nearly deserted when the Neapolitans left in Langführ were suddenly assaulted by swarms of Cossacks, supported by a numerous infantry. General Husson and the commandant Sembeck came up rapidly with a Polish battalion, charged the enemy with the bayonet, and made a dreadful slaughter of them. This check calmed the petulance of the Allies. There was no more question about ladders or assaults. On my side, I left them quiet. I was not in a condition to give them frequent alarms. My troops were exhausted, on their legs, night and day, worn out by disease, pierced with cold, badly clothed, still worse fed. They could with difficulty sustain themselves. Nothing equaled their wretchedness, but the resignation with which they supported it. Soldiers with their noses and ears frostbitten or wounds still open cheerfully performed the service of the advanced posts. When I saw them defiling on parade, muffled up in furs, their heads wrapped in bandages, or walking with the help of sticks, I was affected even to tears. I should willingly have given some relief to men so unfortunate, but yet so constant. The Russians did not suffer it. They had imagined that their proclamations had produced all the effect they expected from them, that we were fighting amongst ourselves, and that the people were in a state of revolt. They resolved to profit by such a fine conjecture and to take us. It was now the month of March. On the 5th, at daybreak, they poured like swarms on my advanced post. They inundated all my line, and spread themselves in multitudes in the villages which it included. At the report of so sudden an attack, I gave the necessary orders and proceeded towards Langführ with the general of division, Grandchamp. We had scarcely gone a few steps when we heard the charge furiously sounded. It was the chiefs of battalion, Clermont and Blauer, who were charging with the bayonet a column of Russians of 3,000 or 4,000 men and dispersing them. We doubled our speed in order to assist them, but the attack had been so impetuous that we could not arrive in time. We reached the village just as the acclamations of the soldiers announced their victory. I hastened to congratulate them on this fine feat of arms, which really it was, as less than 800 men had completely routed 4 times their numbers of infantry and cavalry. They had even nearly got possession of their cannon. 3 Neapolitan voltigeurs were already cutting the traces of the horses that had been killed when they were charged in their turn and obliged to leave their prize. Fortune was less favorable to us in other points. General Franceschi supported himself with difficulty in advance of Alt-Schottland. He gave ground, defending it, however, by foot. He followed the instructions and saved time. The brave Colonel Butler came in haste to his assistance. Scarcely had the Bavarians arrived at the first houses of the village when they rushed with impetuosity on the enemy, repulsed him, charged him with the bayonet, and succeeded in preventing his advance. But while they were making a resistance on one side, the Russians threatened them on the other. After 3 unsuccessful attacks, they had at last triumphed over the fine resistance of the chief of battalion, Clermont. and had made themselves masters of Stolzenberg. They were already debouching from this village and were about to take us in flank. This movement should have been decisive. I hastened to prevent it. I gave orders to the 6th Neapolitan Regiment to occupy on the right a small hill which strengthened our position. General de Cray conducted the attack, charged, and took the summit. The enemy hastily attempted to retake it, but could not succeed. Quite covered with bruises, with his clothes full of holes from bullets, Colonel de Genero opposed an invincible resistance and forced them to retreat. In the meantime, General Baccalou, with 4 battalions under his orders, mounted the heights on the right of Schidlitz. On a sudden, he rushes on the Allies, attacks them in the flank, and overthrows them. In vain they endeavor to fortify themselves in the houses. Our voltigeurs, led on by Lieutenant Bouvenot and the sub-officer Tarid, break through the window frames, destroy the doors, kill, take, or disperse all that they meet, and get possession of one piece of artillery. A Russian general animated his troops to defend it, but the impulse was given 3 brave fellows, the sub-lieutenant Vanu, the quartermasters Autresol, and Hatuit, rushed furiously upon it and get possession of it. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the Allies still occupied Schottland and Ora. Notwithstanding his courage, the chief of battalion Boulan had not been able to dislodge them. I resolved to try a second time a maneuver which had so well succeeded. I turned them, while I led on a false attack by the head of Schottland, General Baccalou, masked his march and went towards Ora. He was followed by 3 battalions of infantry, 150 horses, and a light battery. Our troops boiled with impatience. As soon as they heard the charge begin, they uttered cries of joy, sprang forward against the enemy, broke his ranks, and completely routed him. He rallied and returned to the charge, but the grape shot was redoubled. The bayonet carried disorder among his ranks. He flies. He endeavors to escape through every outlet, but finds none that are not intercepted. Necessity rouses his courage. He rallies, debouches, and rushes on us. The confusion becomes terrible. He struggles to escape from disgrace. Our soldiers, to consummate the victory on either side, they press on. They attack with fury. An adjutant major of the 29th of the line, de Londres, rushed into the middle of the Russians. A few brave fellows followed him. Death and confusion waited on his steps, but soon, overpowered by their number, exhausted by large wounds, he is obliged to lay down his arms, but his spirits return. He recovers himself. Indignation gives him strength. He attacks his escort, takes it, and comes to bear a part in the victory. It was no longer disputed. Our troops, who had come forth at the noise of the firing, had ranged themselves in front of Ora and commenced a destructive firing which overpowered the enemy. He gave way, broke his ranks, and only escaped death by invoking the clemency of the conqueror. In a moment, the streets were heaped with the dead. 500 men laid down their arms. Most of them belonged to that army of Moldavia, which we had almost destroyed at the passage of the Beresina.